Okay, Project Gemini. Project Gemini was the second human space program of NASA, and Gemini is a constellation in the sky, in the night sky, and it's also a zodiac sign, and Gemini are the twins. And interestingly, Project Gemini launched 2 astronauts in the spacecraft. So 2 astronauts, Gemini for twins. Okay, so it went from 1965 to 1966, so for 2 years. 10 Gemini missions were launched, sending 20 astronauts into space. Okay, so we were really launching spacecraft and astronauts pretty quickly during this time. All right, and like I said, there were 2 astronauts in the Gemini spacecraft. Gemini astronauts did the first spacewalks. Here's a picture of that, where the astronaut actually gets in a spacesuit, gets out of the spacecraft into space, and moves around and does things outside the spacecraft. Okay, they did the first docking with another spacecraft, which means 2 spacecraft come together and dock to each other, which means they lock together. And that's a very, very important milestone for humans to be able to go to the moon. They had to be able to dock 2 different spacecraft, so that was very important. So we actually had at 2 of the Gemini missions were up in space at the same time. So 2 different Gemini spacecraft with 4 astronauts total, 2 on each one, came together in orbit and docked, and that was a pretty important thing for them to be able to do. They also set altitude and endurance records, which means altitude means the height that they were able to go was higher in orbit than any other one had ever gone, and endurance means they stayed. Gemini astronauts stayed in space longer than any other had before. Don't remember exactly how long, but it probably wasn't more than a week or 2. All right. These Gemini missions were practice missions for human space flight for the moon. That was the whole purpose, was to, NASA already had a plan to send people to the moon, and these were sort of like, these missions were just practice for that. Okay. So, next we need to talk about Project Apollo. And it was from 1967 through 1975, and Project Apollo's main goal was to send humans to the moon. Okay, and we succeeded in that goal. And just taking a look at a few pictures here. Here's one of the Apollo astronauts on the moon with the United States flag. This spacecraft right here on the moon is the Lunar Lander. Okay, this spacecraft came down from space, came out of orbit around the moon. There's a little rocket engine on the bottom. It fired and slowed it down so it could land. Of course, there's a lot less gravity on the moon. It has 1/6 gravity, so it wasn't as hard to land and take off there as it was as on the Earth. Okay, and then when they were finished exploring on the moon, they got back up in the spacecraft, and this top part right here, there's a rocket engine on the bottom of it, and this top part blasted off and left this bottom part on the moon, and then the top part went back up to the other astronaut that was orbiting the Earth and joined him and went back to Earth. This is a picture of one of the Apollo missions taking off on the Saturn V rocket. This little part right up here is where the astronauts go in the Apollo spacecraft. The lunar lander is down in this part, and the rest of it's just all fuel for the rocket. Okay. This is the Apollo, what's called the command module. Here's the Apollo capsule spacecraft. This command module has all the controls and fuel for it. All right. This is a lunar rover that they were actually able to take with them to the moon. It attached to this spacecraft, and some of the later Apollo missions had this little rover, and the astronauts could get on that and drive around and go further away to explore. This is a picture of the Apollo's command module spacecraft coming back to Earth. After it enters the atmosphere, gets low enough, these parachutes pop out, slow it down, and then it lands in the water, and people come and rescue them. And this picture right here is of a space station called Skylab that was built after we were finished going to the moon. They used some pieces of a Saturn rocket and built a space station out of it. It was America's first space station. Okay. So, Project Apollo. The purpose of Apollo was nothing more than to send astronauts to the moon. Okay. The Apollo spacecraft held 3 astronauts, and the lunar module could hold 2 for a moon landing. Okay. So basically, there's 3 astronauts that get launched from Earth, but only 2 of them get to go to the moon, and the other one has to wait in orbit around the moon. Okay, so let me go back over here. So only 2 Apollo astronauts could fit in the lunar lander spacecraft. The other guy had to wait up here in this Apollo command module while the other 2 landed. He was in orbit around the moon, and then when they got finished, they came back up here and docked again with the Apollo spacecraft, and then went back to Earth. And so the one poor guy, all he got to do was ride along. He didn't get to go to the moon. Alright. The first mission for Apollo that was successful was Apollo 7. In 1968 was just a test flight in Earth orbit. Okay. So there was an Apollo 1, but unfortunately they were testing it on the launch pad, and the inside of the spacecraft caught on fire with 3 astronauts inside it, and they died. It was a very tragic accident that happened in 1967, and it actually set the program back about a year, and it was a big tragedy, but they improved a lot of safety after that, and the astronauts were much safer. So that one, Apollo 1, never even launched it. They weren't even trying to launch it. They were just doing some practicing on the ground, and inside of it caught on fire. Alright, so Apollo 7 in 1968 was just a test flight around in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 in 1968 sent astronauts around the moon. They didn't land on the moon, but they went to the moon and orbited around it and came back. It was the first time that humans had ever left Earth orbit. Okay, and then the first moon landing was in July of 1969 on Apollo 11. Okay, that was the very famous one where Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon and said, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." So there were 6 total successful missions to the moon. So there's only been 12 humans who have ever walked on the moon. The last few missions included a lunar rover, the little car, this little thing right here, that allowed the astronauts to explore more of the surface of the moon. Okay. Each mission brought back rocks from the moon for scientists to study. And scientists are still studying those rocks, 45 years later. It's, by studying the rocks on the moon, we have been able to figure out, the origin of the moon, where it came from, how it's related to Earth and the rest of the solar system. And if you go take a tour of NASA in Houston, you can see some of the moon rocks. There's actually a moon rock at the Bob Bullock Texas History Museum in Austin if you wanted to see one also. The last mission to the moon was in 1972, Apollo 17, and we have never returned to the moon. Nobody from the United States has ever returned to the moon, nobody from any other country. So if you think about it, that was 44 years ago. And I was a baby in 1972 when that last mission went to the moon. All right. Oh, I need to say one more thing about Apollo. There was one mission, I think a lot of you have seen the movie, called Apollo 13. Apollo 13 would have been the 3rd mission to land on the moon, but when it was on the way, the spacecraft, there was an explosion on the spacecraft, and some oxygen started leaking out, and they were unable to land on the moon. They were already on the way to the moon, so they had to go to the moon and swing around it and come back to Earth, and they managed to be able to do that even though their spacecraft was damaged, and they managed to get back to Earth safely. So if you ever get a chance to see the movie Apollo 13, it's actually a very true story.